Hey guys, welcome back. If you don't already know it, July is World Watercolour Month. It's basically every artist, every student, every teacher, every watercolour painting person comes together in this incredible month of July for 31 days to create art, share art, and help anybody out that wants to get started for the first time ever. So if you are new to anything to do with watercolour and want to give it a shot, this month will be the perfect time to start because there's about 100 challenges going on. I've got one that's going on at the moment, which is a watercolour contribution for this month. And if you use my hashtag, if you tag me in, I'll feature you in my stories and highlights to share all your amazing creations. And of course, just to help me find new artists, because let's face it, Instagram algorithm is a bit ridiculous. And trying to look through their search and finding new amazing artists is pretty much impossible. For this video, I wanted to talk about two particular items, and one is Arches papers and another is gouache watercolour. I call Arches paper vampire paper because it absorbs water like nobody's business. If you wanted to apply pigment, you'll have to add a fair few layers in order to get a very vibrant colour. Gouache paint is basically, it dries very, very quickly. So using a very absorbent paper with a very dry medium, it's a hard balance to find. For this painting that I'm creating, I use Winsor & Newton gouache paints, and for this painting, as you can see, I'm layering down a very heavy layer of colour, and I'll let you know why towards the end of the video. But to create the gradient that I have in the middle of my painting, I apply a very heavy layer of gouache, and then I get a very wet straight edge or slanted edge brush, and I sort of drag it across the centre of the page, lifting paint and letting it spread further up the page, giving it that wonderful gradient. Now the pigment that I ended up creating is a lot more greener than my original painting, which was a bit more brownish green, but this sort of reminded me of when it's just rained and everything has like a sort of misty green tint to it, and I really liked the colour and I just sort of went with it. I'm going in now and I'm adding tree trunks and I'm blocking them out in the far side of the painting because my focus is the middle of the painting. Now with gouache, like I said, it dries up very quickly, and it dried up on my brush very, very quickly, so I had to constantly keep dipping my brush in water in order to get the paint to activate. And I've used a smaller brush for this particular painting. Considering it's an A7 painting, the small brush was better for me to use because adding details is a little bit of a nightmare with gouache paint. So having a smaller brush, I could easily add thickness to parts of the painting that I need very easily, and it enabled me to have much more smoother lines without worrying about losing detail. I take a segment of my pigment that I created at the beginning of the video and I water it down as much as possible. This is going to be the paint that I use to create the trees in the background. And because the paper is already fairly absorbent, I can apply very faint layers to create more distance within the trees, or add more layers to make them darker to seem like they're much closer. So those sorts of techniques and the quality of these materials, it worked for me. in order to keep the painting very consistent, I try and mimic what I've created in the foreground and applying them into the background. And once I'm happy with my current structure of trees, I go in and start adding the leaves. And I use a sort of stippling technique in order to apply them very loosely around the painting. It makes it a bit more interesting, gives the trees a lot more length, it frames the painting very well, it gives a very rounded off atmosphere, it brings it all together into the middle of the painting. So at this point, just pick certain parts of the top half of your painting and apply the leaves very loosely, because those are the darker leaves that are going to serve in the foreground, and go in afterwards with a very much wet brush with the pigment, applying them around the darker leaves, creating the depth as you go further into the forest. I suppose at this point it would be a good idea to have a look at your piece as a whole, because you've got the main elements in now. You've got the trees, you've got the background, you've got the groundwork, and you've got the leaves, and you can see where you need to add more layers of any of those elements. See where you could add finer details and make it a bit more to what you want. For the highlights, I'm using a Gouache Winsor & Newton zinc white, and the paint was so dry on my brush, I had to constantly keep wetting it, like I've said throughout, applying it onto the tree trunks. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, that I applied a very thick layer of gouache for the groundwork, and I'm applying white paint on top and mixing it in with water, activating that gouache paint at the bottom, creating a very pale green to act as texture for the groundwork. The thing that I've realized about gouache paint is that you need to really think about your layers before you start painting. I mean, like with any paint, you have to think about your foreground and where your highlights are and things like that. But I think with gouache, you really need to think about where your lighter colors are going to sit, and it really does make a difference to how your painting comes together. But it works both ways. I've posted up some paintings where my darker colors were the last thing that I painted on top of the paler colors. It, at the end of the day, I suppose, is what you want to show and what is going to be the most detailed part of your painting. Applying those little textures really brought the painting in for me, and I ended up liking this one more than the one that I posted on Instagram because of the atmosphere and the colours that was in it. But thanks so much for watching this video. Hopefully it answered some queries and some questions about using Arches paper and using gouache paint. I feel like it is a paint that everybody should have at least in their toolbox, because even if you don't use gouache as a sole subject in your painting, you can use it in elements of your drawings, even if it's just watercolour paints, and it's such a versatile material to use. If you have any questions, just let me know, and hopefully I can get around to answering them, whether it's on my Instagram, Facebook, or even YouTube. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye.